So in this video, we're going to be implementing this animation from scratch in React Native, which is inspired from this demo on Twitter, originally created by Philip Davis using SwiftUI. So we're going to be implementing the same, but with some minor additions, like the anchor at the bottom, on click of which we can open and close, and on click of the colors, it can change the background of the screen. Other than that, the palette view is gesture based, so it's going to follow our touch movements on the screen and rotate the palette layers. And every palette layer is going to have different degree rotations. And if the rotation degree amount is more than 90 degree, it's going to be open like this. And if it is not, it's going to go back to its original position, which is this. So this is what we're going to be building. So let's get right into it. So first we're going to be creating the UI, and then we will implement the gesture and animation. Let's first understand the packages that we're going to be using, and we're mainly going to be using gesture handler to detect the gesture and performing actions, the rotation of the palettes, and reanimated is for the animation. And on the code side, I've already created a few variables. This is the array of colors, and it's going to have a 6 layers of palettes, and each layer is going to contain 3 colors. And this is the fixed width and height of the palette. So let's start with the UI. The container is going to be safe area view, and the style is going to be container flags of 1. Now this view is going to be the container of the palettes, the layers of palettes. So view, and I'm going to give it a style of palette size, which is going to be the fixed width and height of the palette based on the global variables. Inside this, we're going to render the palette layers, and for that we're going to have to loop through the array and return the component. And I'm going to create a separate component for the palette because the gesture and animation logic is going to be separate, individual for each layer based on the index. So let's create a new component, palette item. For now, I'm just going to return a view and return this component here. We can pass these props and access it here. Let's give it a style of palette container. And it's going to have a style of position of absolute because each palette is going to render above the other, and a background color of white, and the size is going to be the same. Okay, let's give it a padding of 4 so that there's some spacing, and border radius of, let's say, 20. Now inside this we're going to render the colors, and for that we can loop through this array. Let's first create the type for this component. I'm going to create the interface palette prop, colors of type string array, and index of type number. So the color is of type array. We can loop through it and render different colors. This is going to be index, and the color component is going to be pressable because later on we're going to, on click of a color, change the background of the screen, and you can pass it a key of index, and style is going to be color item. Now this is going to be flex 1 so that each color is distributed equally on the container, and width is going to be 100%. Nothing happened. We're going to have to provide it color. It's going to be this. Okay, let's give the color a border radius of 8, and let's create a spacing between the colors, and for that we can pass it here as a margin bottom of 4. And to avoid it for the last item, we can do ci if the index is less than the color length -1, then the margin bottom is going to be 4, else it's going to be 0. Now for the top item, the border radius combination looks weird, so we can add another conditional style. For that, if the index is 0, we can pass it a style of, let's say, color top, which is going to be border top left radius of same 20, and border top right radius of 20. Now it looks better. And the next part is to render the anchor on the palette. This is also going to be addressable. Let's give it a style of anchor container. It's going to have a fixed height of 50, and width is going to be 100%. The anchor view is going to be centered, so for that, justify content center and align items center. Now let's create the anchor view. It's going to be 2 inner circles. The first is going to be anchor outer circle. The inner is going to be the anchor inner circle. It's going to have a fixed width and height of, let's say, 24. It's now going to show border radius is going to be the half of the size, and we're going to have to provide it a width, border width of 1. And for anchor inner circle, the size is going to be a little shorter than the outer, so it's going to be 16 and height of 16. Border radius of 16 divided by 2. Let's give it a color of black. It should be centered. That's better. Now the palette view should be bottom aligned, so for that we can do justify content flex. Let's give this a margin, and we can assign it here, as this is used both here and here, so we can assign here margin of 40. So now there's a little spacing. So most of the UI is done. Now the next part is to detect the gesture, and for that, first we need to wrap the container with gesture handler root view. It is kind of required by gesture handler to detect the gesture, especially on Android, and it should have a style of flex of 1 so that it contains the whole screen. And now we're going to have to wrap the area where we want to detect the gesture, that is the palette view. So for that, we're gonna have to wrap it around with a gesture detector, which requires a gesture prop having the handler. I'm gonna call it drag gesture. And it's gonna have a pan gesture because we're tracking the touch interactions of the user. So it's gonna have a pan gesture. And we mainly need 3 callbacks from this, which is on start when the user interaction is initiated, on update when user is actively interacting with the screen, and on end when the touch interaction has ended. Now what we're going to do on this callback is, based on the user touch on the screen, we're going to calculate the angle of rotation from a certain point. So whatever the user's touch is on the screen, the finger position or the mouse, we're going to calculate that position from a certain point, say this anchor, and calculate a degree, the angle, and based on that we're going to rotate the palette. So for that I'm going to create a function called calculate degree, which is going to take the event, same here, and also on the on update. It's going to be of the type okay. Now if you now touch on the palette, you notice that you get this error, and that is because by default for the gesture handler and reanimated, their callbacks by default run on the UI thread, and the function that we create runs on the JavaScript thread. So we cannot synchronously call both threads from each other. That is what the error says. So either both should be on the UI thread or both should be on the JavaScript thread. So to work around this or to fix this, there are 2 solutions. First is we tell the gesture handler to run the callbacks on the JS thread, and for that we gotta pass this function run on JS to true, and now we're gonna have to refresh it, and now we're not gonna get the error. And the other way is to add a line at the top of the function called worklet with a single quote and semicolon, and this is also gonna fix the error. Now what happens in this case, we're telling the React Native that we want to run this function that we created not on the JavaScript thread but on the UI thread. So in this case what's going to happen is that the gesture handler callbacks for the gesture and our function are both going to be on the UI thread, so it's not going to create any conflicts. Now you probably don't want this when you suppose updating a state or like accessing a view, but in our case we only going to be doing basic calculations, so it doesn't really matter where we run the function on, whether on UI or JavaScript. So in our situation I'm going to go with this. And let's also fix this key error. We're gonna have to provide a key here. I'm gonna just give it a, let's say, index. Now inside this function we're gonna calculate the degree of rotation from the user's touch interaction from a certain point. So whatever the user touch interaction on the screen is gonna be, we're gonna calculate the degree from a certain point. And for that I'm going to create a variable degree, and I'm going to use a math function to get the arc tangent of the user touch from a certain point, and I'm going to use a10 because it accepts x and y both. And inside this function we're going to have to provide the x and y value, and so whatever the value that we provide to this function is going to calculate the angle for that from the origin, and the origin is going to be where the x and y both are 0. So let's first add the parameters. For that I'm going to use e.y and e.x, the coordinates of the user touch from with respect to the area that we are detecting. And now if we print these variables on the console log, if you see the log, when we start the touch, the y value starts from the top, and as we go down it reaches to the 250 value that we provided to the palette height. And same is for the x, starts from the 0 on the left and goes to the full width at the right side. So the origin by default right now is at the top of left. So if when we drag on the palette, the function is going to return an angle from this origin, and we kind of want it from the bottom center at the anchor position, so we can rotate the palette from that point. So to do that, what we can do is we can subtract this value from palette height, and for the x, to get the center, we can subtract it by palette width, half of the palette width. And now if we like print these values, we see that now it's starting from 250, and as we go to the bottom it reaches to 0. So now the origin is going to be at this bottom center, and now when we drag on the palette it's going to return an angle with respect to this point. This is the origin. And now that we got this value, and this is currently in radians, so I'm going to convert it to degree, as that may make the calculation a little easier. I'm going to use math pi, because that is the formula to convert the radians to degree. And in the end we're going to return this degree value from the function. Now remember, by default this degree value is going to be with respect to the x-axis, the right axis, and our palette is by default is on the top axis. So to get the correct value of the degree with respect to our palette's default axis position, we're going to have to subtract it by 90. Now we will get the correct value of degree, and the next step is to assign this value to a certain variable. So for that I'm going to create a variable of gesture degree, and it's going to be use shared value with a default value of 0. Now a shared value is a hook from reanimated that we use to store animated values, and those values are that we assign to a component style property that we want to animate, which in our case is going to be the palette views transform property to apply the rotation. So I'm gonna assign the variable and when the touch interaction ends, we're just gonna have to check if the value is more than 90 degree. We're gonna snap it open, which is at the 90 degree. That means the palette is open, and if it is not, it's gonna go back to its initial position, which is 0. We don't really need this event. Now the gesture part is done. Now the next part is to actually apply the rotation. And for that, I'm going to pass this variable as a prop to this component. And it's going to be a shared value of type number. Now to actually apply the animation, we're going to use another hook from reanimated called use animated style. Now this is another hook from reanimated that we use to return the style properties that we want to animate for a particular component. It can be text or a view or anything. And in our case, it's going to be transform. So we return an object, and on those properties we apply the shared value. These are animated values, and whenever these values update, reanimated automatically animates those property and apply the animation on the component. So transform rotate, and in this we're going to apply the rotation with a spring animation. It's going to take degree and we're going to have to apply this style on the view, and this view should be an animated view imported from reanimated, not React Native. Now when we do the rotation, you see that the rotation is indeed working, but all the layers of the palettes are rotating together, and we kind of want the degree value for each layer to be different. So for that, I'm going to do a calculation. It's going to be gesture degree value divide color palette of length -1 index. Now based on the degree value, suppose 90, we are dividing it by the 1 less the length of the color palette, and we are subtracting it by 1 because remember the initial, the 0th position item is always going to be in this position. It's not going to rotate. Only the other 5 are going to rotate. So that's why we're doing it. And now that we get this data, so suppose it is 90, it's going to get a different degree value for all these 6 layers. So it's going to be 90, 72, 54, and so on and so forth. So now we can apply this angle value here. And now when we rotate this, you can see that every layer has a different rotation value. But it is not really what we want, because if you can see, it is rotating from the center, and that is because the main transform origin point, when we apply a rotation for a view, is on the center. So that's why it is rotating on the center. And what we want it to rotate from the bottom, that is the anchor position. And so for that, what we have to do is we have to shift the transform origin. And one way to do that in React Native is, before we apply the rotation, we shift the view up to a certain distance, then we apply the rotation, and then we reverse the shift or translate. So let's understand it with the code. So we're gonna first translate y, the palette, by a certain distance, which is gonna be palette height divided by 2, because it's rotating from the center. So we're just gonna have to shift the origin by half of the palette height. And now after we apply the rotation, we just do the same thing but in reverse. Now as you can see, it is giving us the correct result. But still, the anchor position is moving a lot. It should be still at this particular point, and now currently it is moving a lot. So to fix this, what we can do is we can ignore the size of the anchor, which is 50. So here we can do subtract of 50. And now the anchor position is always going to be at this point. And now when we rotate the palette, it is correctly rotating with the movement of our finger on the screen or mouse. And if we rotate more than 90 degree, it's going to snap back to the 90, and if it is less than 90, it's going to go back to initial position. Now currently the spring is a little too springy, so we can reduce this by giving it a less mass, let's say 0.4. Okay, I think it's better. So most of the work for this color swatch is done. Now the remaining things are just some actions. To on the click of the anchor, we do the same thing, and on the click of the colors, we're going to change the background of the screen. So first let's add the action for the anchor. So on anchor press, if gesture value, we do the same thing that we did on the end of the gesture. If the gesture value is 0, that means it is at this initial position. If it is 0, and when we click on it, it's going to snap to the 90 degree to open the palette, and if it is already 90 degree, then it's going to go back to its initial position. Oh, we didn't assign the value. Okay, so it is working fine on click and on gesture. Now the next step is on the click of the colors, it should change the background of the screen. So for that, I'm going to create a new where state. It's going to be active color, set active color, use state. I'm gonna give it a default color of this one. I'm gonna pass this value as a prop to the component, and I'm gonna create another callback on color press. Which is where we update the color, and this is going to be called in this function. So if a color is pressed, we're going to pass the color value. It's going to take a color value of string, and I'm just going to set the set active color. And to really update the result, we're going to have to assign the active color on certain views. So first we assign it on the container, background color of active color. And now when you see, when we click on a color, it is successfully changing the color of the screen. And let's also change the color of the anchor as we click on the color. So for this is going to be the border color, and for the inner circle It's gonna be the background color, this. Now it is also changing the color for the anchor and in the screen background. And now as we assign the background here, we can remove it from here. Okay, so most of the palette is done, the color swatch implementation. Now if you rotate it on the both side, you notice that on the right side it is rotating to complete 270-degree, and on the left side it is only rotating to 90-degree. So we can work around this by adding a condition here that if the degree is less than 90, then we're just gonna update the degree value to plus 360. And this should be flat. This is just to have the possible 180-degree rotation on both sides. To see it properly, we can increase the margin. Now rotating completely 180-degree on the both sides. So our implementation for the color swatch is completed and it is working fine on iOS. And next step is to test this on Android. Now here's the implementation running on Android, and as you can see, it is working just fine. The dragging, clicking of anchor, and the changing of color. But still we can do a little UI improvement. As you know, on iOS it covers the whole screen, but on Android we have to specifically provide the background color of the status bar, and that we can do using status bar component from React Native. So let's import status bar, and the bar style is going to be light content, and for the background color we can provide our state active color, and we can also remove this console log from here. And now if you see, when we change the color, it is also going to change the background color of the status bar. So now our implementation on Android is more or less replicating the behavior of iOS. So it is also complete for Android. And now that it's done, next we're going to test this on web. Now here's the implementation running on the web, and it is working just as expected. The dragging behavior are exactly the same as they are on the mobile devices. We can open and close, and on click of the color we can also change the background. So it is also working fine on web. So our implementation is working on 3 platforms: Android, iOS, and web. So I think that's pretty much it about this video. Do let me know what you think about this or any suggestions in the comments. So I hope you liked the video, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.